Thank you very much for the words of an introduction and for the privilege afforded to me to deliver a paper at this very important symposium. I also wish to thank the Heritage Association of South Africa for everything that it does to promote an interest in heritage matters and its role to preserve our shared history. A special word of thanks is also due to Andre Botha, the symposium convener, to Deborah Stewart as Clarens Heritage Association President, to Kathy Munro, and also to all other persons involved in organizing this symposium. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, what I am presenting to you today was written by myself and was not generated by artificial intelligence, and I place intelligence in quotation marks. October 2024 marks the start of the 125th anniversary of the outbreak of the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. It is not possible to understand the history of 20th century South Africa if one does not have an understanding of the consequences that the Anglo-Boer War had for all South Africans. But how should a terrible conflict be commemorated? And what are the implications for heritage? Past, present, and future. To shed light on these and related matters, I shall inter alia look back at the Anglo-Boer War centennial of the years 1999 to 2002. What can be learned from that centennial? It is indeed also time to once again take stock of the impact that the most devastating conflict that has thus far raged in what is today South Africa had on all the people of this region, and thus also in the light of everything that has been written since the start of the war centennial in 1999, to reimagine the Anglo-Boer War, and as far as possible provide new perspectives or re-emphasize some of the older perspectives with an eye on the road ahead. More questions will be posed than clear-cut answers provided to many of the issues that are raised. But then, of course, one must keep in mind what the Dutch historian Pieter Geil said many years ago, namely that history is a debate without end. In each new phase of a country's history, each new generation can and must ask new questions about the past, and also with regard to heritage and how it could be and how it should be preserved. As far as the Anglo-Boer War is concerned, for the record, a few basic facts. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 11th of October 2024, it was exactly 125 years since the Anglo-Boer War broke out on that fateful day, Wednesday, the 11th of October, 1899. In just more than 2.5 years that followed the outbreak of hostilities, at least 7,792 British soldiers had been killed, according to official figures, or had succumbed to wounds due to wounds sustained in battle, while 14,658 had died of disease or in accidents. Furthermore, more than 75,000 British soldiers were sent home either ill or wounded. It is not clear how many black and brown people who served on the side of the British became casualties. At least 3,990 Boers and comrades, for example, Cape Colony and Natal rebels, and also foreign volunteers, were killed on the battlefield, and at least 157 died in accidents, while those who died on commando owing to disease or wounds sustained in battle numbered at least 924. A further 1,118 died as prisoners of war. As far as the civilian population was concerned, at least 28,000 white people, but probably more, died in the internment camps, most of them women and children younger than 16, as well as at least 23,000, but probably many more black people. There is a possibility, by the way, that more black people than white people died in the internment camps. The Anglo-Boer War was a bloody and devastating conflict, traumatizing hundreds of thousands of people of different cultures and on both sides of the opposing sides. But in this day and age, in 2024, the question is it fit and proper to commemorate such events? After all, what is the prize of victory? The prize is often merely a battlefield strewn with the remains of dead human beings, of friend and foe. What a prize! And what a price to pay for so-called heroism and glory. Moreover, it should be kept in mind that war does not determine who is right, but merely determines who survives. We can all think of what is at this very moment happening in the Ukraine and in Gaza and in Israel. The views of people with regard to commemoration of conflicts are, of course, controversial, but it is respected. One cannot understand history in general without knowledge of and insight into how conflicts contribute towards historical developments, for the better or the worse. The fact of the matter is that military history is studied by thousands of people across the globe and is appreciated by many millions. And worldwide, there are also hundreds, if not thousands, of military museums, including some of the most prominent ones which I have been privileged to visit in the course of many years, such as the Imperial War Museum and the National Army Museum in London, the Royal Navy's Museum in Portsmouth in the south of England, the Naval Museum in Norfolk, Virginia in the United States of America, the Austrian Army Museum in Vienna, the Dutch Military Museum in Soesterberg, known as the Nationaal Militair Museum, and the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Not to forget the War Museum of the Boer Republics in Bloemfontein, as well as several other military and, of course, many other museums in South Africa. These museums are important tourist attractions and centers of research, but they also preserve our military heritage, which forms part of our shared heritage in general. They are often also the focus points of commemorations, and from time to time have special exhibitions that commemorate a particular war or a particular event. See in this regard, for example, several special exhibitions at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, as well as other museums in Australia, to coincide with the Great or First World War centennial. And there were similar World War exhibitions at several other museums across the globe. It is problematic, yet understandable, when hero myths and other myths are created during and in the wake of a conflict. It is unfortunately so that the victors often write the history and determine whose praises will be sung and who will be demonized. Consequently, there can also be efforts to obliterate the heritage of certain cultures and groups in a society. Nevertheless, it is human nature to commemorate events. We commemorate birthdays, wedding anniversaries, Independence Days, and many other events. Everything taken into consideration, it is also proper to commemorate the outbreak of a bloody war, the events that took place in the course of the conflict, and also the conclusion of peace. But it is, of course, important that the commemoration should take place in the correct spirit, not to refight the battles of the past, not to open up old wounds, not to ostracize or to vilify the enemy, the other side, depending on one's perspective, not to hero worship, but rather to use the opportunity to reflect and to take stock of one's own, but also in the South African context, one's shared history and heritage. Thus, commemorations must be inclusive. Let us now very briefly look at past Anglo-Boer War commemorations. On the 10th of October 1974, 10 October was then still a public holiday, as some of us will remember here in South Africa. The 75th anniversary of the outbreak of the Anglo-Boer War was commemorated in Bloemfontein, in other words, a day before the actual anniversary date. There was a short ceremony at the Bloemfontein internment camp site adjacent to the Kimberley Road, and then three simultaneous commemorative ceremonies. One at the statue of President M.T. Steyn, then still standing in front of what was then the University of the Orange Free State, the statue of General C.R. de Wet in President Brand Street, and in the Dutch Reformed churches Tweektorenkerk. Later, in front of the Women's Memorial, wreaths were laid. In the political context of the 1970s, this commemoration was a whites-only event. Let's now fast forward 25 years to 1999 and the start of the centenary of the Anglo-Boer War. In the period October 1999 to June 2002, there were more than 100 centennial events all over South Africa. This centennial took place in the context of the so-called New South Africa, Indeed, it was the first major heritage event to take place after the dramatic political changes of 1994, in other words, when the ANC formed the first government of national unity at that stage, in a truly democratic South Africa. It took place in a South Africa with a more open and inclusive society. Unfortunately, since then, and in particular the last few years, the general discourse in the country has become more racialized. From 1999 to 2002, the majority of the non-governmental events were coordinated by a national committee which was formed as early as 1994 and was called the Central Steering Committee for the Commemoration of the Anglo-Boer War. In 1996, the question of whether to get involved in the commemoration or not was discussed by the ANC government. As from November 1998, the commemoration was adopted as a legacy project by the then Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology. The goals of the centennial included the following: to honor those who died on all sides, to increase interest and knowledge about the war and its consequences amongst the general public, and to make people aware of the importance of history. To promote a positive image of South Africa, and thus to promote tourism from overseas as well as from within South Africa, which would then boost employment and economic growth. To preserve and upgrade historic sites, monuments, etc., to promote reconciliation and nation building, and to increase scientific knowledge about the War of 1899 to 1902. All the above-mentioned goals can and should be applied to the 125th anniversary of the war and all other anniversaries. The centennial commemorative events included the unveiling of new or the rededication of old monuments, the commemoration of battles, which often included some form of reenactment, concerts, dance performances, plays, festivals, and sports meetings. Many of us probably attended some of these events. The upgrading of historical sites connected with the war, as well as of the infrastructure necessary to reach the sites. And there were also academic conferences. One can only hope that the 125th anniversary will also lead to the above-mentioned kinds of events taking place across the country. As has already happened at the War Museum in Bloemfontein, when 10 days ago, on Saturday the 12th of October, there was an Anglo-Boer War 125 commemorative event. The Anglo-Boer War centenary was covered extensively, especially in newspapers. The local Afrikaans newspaper in Bloemfontein, Volksblad, for example, published something on the war almost on a daily basis. Hopefully, the South African media will once again play a constructive role in informing the public about the importance of the latest commemoration. In the meantime, since the end of the Anglo-Boer War centenary in 2002, many people across the globe took part in the Great or First World War 1940-1918 centenary. With the exception of events at Delville Wood and with regard to the sinking of the Mendi, this centenary, unfortunately, to a very large extent, was neglected in South Africa, albeit that certain military units, for example, the School of Armour in Bloemfontein, veterans organizations, and others did pay homage to those South Africans of all cultural groups that took part and paid the highest price. After all, something like 12,000 South Africans died in that conflict. At present, the 80th anniversary of the Second World War of 1939 to 1945 continues across the globe. Unfortunately, once again, a commemoration that has largely been neglected in South Africa. Commemorations are often relatively insignificant events, but in some instances they can have far-reaching consequences for a society. For example, by creating enhanced feelings of cohesion and nationalism, for the better or for the worse. See, for example, the Great Track Centennial of 1938 and the concomitant rise of Afrikaner nationalism. It can and should also focus attention on heritage issues. But commemorations can also divide a society. For example, when certain groups are excluded, or when politicians misuse events to score political points. Ideally, however, commemorations should be a source of learning about and creating an interest in the past. Everything considered, the Anglo-Boer War Centennial was a successful series of events. It was inclusive of all cultural groups. It was well organized. It received a lot of publicity, and many new books and articles were published on various aspects of the war, including topics that had, at least to some extent, been neglected in the past. For example, black participation and the effect that the war had on civilians in general, but black civilians in particular. Since 2002, South Africa has unfortunately experienced many, many problems. But this should not be an excuse not to commemorate the 125th anniversary of the Anglo-Boer War. As a matter of fact, the country needs positive action and positive experiences. This Heritage Association of South Africa Symposium and its wider program is exactly the type of event that we need to promote the preservation of our shared heritage, in conjunction with the commemoration of an important event such as the Anglo-Boer War. See in this regard, for example, the walking tour of Clarens landmark historical buildings, the walking tour of Clarens Nature Reserve, where nature is part of our natural heritage, and which will also be preserved for all to enjoy. The Anglo-Boer War tour, but which includes a visit to the Free State Basotho War Memorial on the Clarens Square, the Golden Gate Highland National Park and Basotho Cultural Village tour, the dinosaur hunting expedition, and the Sandstone Heritage Tour to Fariesburg. All these above-mentioned events could perhaps be repeated on a regular basis in an effort to draw even more visitors to Clarens and to diversify the visitors' experiences. In the process, promoting heritage tourism and the preservation of our rich shared heritage. What about a Brandwater hiking trail, if in case it does not already exist? But in line with the Sandstone Heritage Tour to Fariesburg, similar tours could be organized with regard to historically and or architecturally important buildings in, for example, Vicksburg, Bethlehem, Harrismith, Kestel, and linking it to or having it separate from tours to Anglo-Boer War and other sites in and around these and other towns. The Eastern Free State is, after all, an area of natural beauty, but also a heritage-rich part of South Africa in terms of military history and many other dimensions of history. This, of course, also applies to many other areas of South Africa. Over and above these possible initiatives, lecture and or discussion weekends can also be held, for example, on topics such as the Anglo-Boer War, the Border War, which forms part of the Great War for Southern Africa of 1961 to 2002, and also topics like Afrikaans literature, South African literature, and other literatures of Southern Africa. To understand why it is important to revisit the past, and thus also to commemorate a war such as the Anglo-Boer War, it is important that one must understand the impact that this war had on the history of South Africa. The Anglo-Boer War was the 226th of 230 wars, campaigns, and punitive expeditions in which the British Army took part in the 64-year reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. Although both the British and the Boers initially regarded the Anglo-Boer War as a gentleman's war, as well as a white man's war, the conflict was, right from the start, neither the one nor the other. This traumatic conflict may be regarded as the first liberation struggle of the 20th century, with the Afrikaners being the first African freedom fighters. To this day, it is the most extensive and destructive war that has been fought on what is today South Africa. Just as in the case with the history of South Africa in general, and for that matter, all history, the history of the Anglo-Boer War is also not simplistic. Seldom in history can clear-cut good people and bad people be identified. In an effort to understand the often complex political, social, and even economic developments in a country or region, it is important that the wars and other forms of conflict that have shaped society are studied in an unbiased way. In the South Africa of today, there are many people who are disillusioned, angry, or bitter, or all these things and more. There are people who are apparently suffer from historical amnesia. In other words, they do not know who they are, where they come from, or where exactly they are, historically speaking today, or where they are heading. Many South Africans are also traumatized. Some are traumatized by the events that happened in the past. For example, the humiliation and hardships suffered in the years 1948 to 1990 under apartheid, or by more recent events, such as racial incidents or crime. There are those South Africans who yearn back to the so-called good old days. And then there are those who are intent on refighting the battles of the past, including those that took place between the Boers, Afrikaners, and the British during the Anglo-Boer War. How can the commemoration of, for example, the Anglo-Boer War contribute towards our healing? Perhaps by inculcating all South Africans with a sense of belonging, by explaining how and why South Africans share the same past, by making sure that ideally also much of our heritage is indeed part and parcel of a shared heritage. As many South Africans, especially young people, must be convinced to get off the streets and into museums and libraries. But then they must understand the value of South Africa's historical sites and of museums, and of books, real books, not merely words on screens. Time is running out. The past years have seen the ominous increase of racism in South Africa and of the radicalization of politics in the country. It seems as if a large group of the young generation of people either do not know the history of their country or who are not indeed interested in their own or shared history. But how many of their parents know the history of South Africa? The 125th anniversary of the Anglo-Boer War affords all South Africans to once again, or for the first time, take stock of who they are, who they would like to be, and where they are or should be heading. In order to do that, young people and others must go to or be taken to physical sites, not merely websites, that remind them of their past, their history, including the history of the Anglo-Boer War and their heritage. For historically mature people, it goes without saying that a country's statues, monuments, historical buildings, and sites of historical importance and of natural beauty must be preserved, and that a country's museums must be properly funded and the artifacts kept by them must be preserved for the broader public to view, to value, and to enjoy. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. Since 2016, several of South Africa's statues have been vandalized or removed. For many years, many old historic buildings have been neglected, damaged, and in some instances destroyed. In the light of security concerns, it is these days not even possible to visit some of the historical sites in South Africa, including certain battlefields. This situation has negative implications for commemorative events, but also have grave negative consequences for the developments of South Africa's tourism industry. In a country which, in terms of its natural beauty, is indeed a world in one country, and with so many cultural groups calling South Africa their home, there is vast tourism potential. In the light of serious economic challenges, tourism has the potential to create many more employment opportunities and to lead to the development of many towns and villages. However, nothing will change as long as there are people who do not understand and appreciate the value of South Africa's shared historical heritage, including the country's military heritage. You can move a statue from one place to another, albeit that ideally statues should stay in their physical historical context where they were originally erected and unveiled. You can even move a museum to a safer site, as happened with the Paardeberg Museum. Once again, not ideal, but necessary under the circumstances. But you cannot move a battlefield or a whole internment camp site or large fortifications. And you cannot place everything on a screen. All South Africans have indeed a shared responsibility to take stock of their own and shared South African past, and to contribute towards safeguarding and the preservation of South Africa's heritage. The ideal is that the 125th anniversary of the Anglo-Boer War will lead to greater insight into this bloody and traumatic conflict and the way in which it was influenced, how it has influenced developments in South Africa over the course of the 20th century. Lead to the restoration, where necessary, of historical monuments, buildings, and sites pertaining to this conflict. Lead to all people of all cultural groups visiting our museums and places of historical interest, and lead to tourists from across the globe flocking to South Africa, not only to see the Big Five, the animals, or the majestic Table Mountain, but also to explore the country's historical sites and museums, and in the process develop a better understanding of South Africa's checkered and complicated but also fascinating history. And hopefully many more South Africans of all cultural groups will also become travelers and explorers in their own country. Present-day South Africans must prove that it is possible for the negative consequences of our checkered history of the past, consisting of trauma and all the negative experiences that people suffered either individually or collectively, to end. Knowledge and insight with regards to South Africa's checkered past, including the history of the Anglo-Boer and its traumatic consequences, are therefore of paramount importance. It must be kept in mind that history enables one to forgive without the need to forget. It is the ideal that it will, in this spirit, that the 125th anniversary of the Anglo-Boer War will take place. The Anglo-Boer War, just as all other wars, should be commemorated, lest we forget. Hopefully, the 125th anniversary will get the necessary publicity so that the message with regard to the significance of the conflict of 1899 to 1902 will filter through to a large portion of the South African population. After all, through the commemoration of this war, there is a unique opportunity to ensure the future of South Africa's past and our shared heritage. And that shared heritage, without any doubt, includes the history of the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. Thank you very much for the opportunity afforded to me to speak here today, and thank you very much for your kind attention.